The heavy, gold-leafed doors of the Grand Horizon Ballroom did not just open. They seemed to buckle under the sudden, suffocating weight of absolute silence. A split second ago, the space had been a symphony of clinking crystal, soft harp strings, and the self-congratulatory laughter of 500 elite guests. They had all gathered to witness a coronation of cruelty disguised as a wedding. But the moment the threshold cleared, the air went completely dead. Every head snapped toward the entrance. The breath caught in the groom's throat, turning to ice. Standing there was not the broken, destitute woman he had spent months planning to publicly destroy. Before we dive into the dark, twisted reality of what happened inside that ballroom, hello and the warmest welcome to every single one of you tuning in today. I am so incredibly grateful to have you here with us. Take a quick moment to drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you are watching from in the world. I love reading your responses and seeing how far our community reaches. How are you all doing today? If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Trust me, you do not want to miss a single second of the emotional, high-stakes stories we bring to this channel every single week. Your support means everything, so subscribe now and join our growing family. Now let us step back into that room where the trap that had been so carefully set was about to snap shut on the person who built it. Julian Vance stood at the altar, his tailored tuxedo suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. His knuckles turned white where they gripped the hand of his radiant, smirking fiancée, Clara. For 6 months, Julian had eaten, slept, and breathed a singular toxic obsession, the total and utter humiliation of his ex-wife, Elena. When their marriage tore apart 3 years ago under a cloud of engineered scandals and vicious rumors that Julian himself had paid to circulate, he had stripped her of everything. He had taken her dignity, her family's legacy, and left her with a ruined reputation and a bank account drained to zero. He had forced her out into the cold, ensuring the high society circles they once walked in viewed her as an untouchable failure. Inviting her to this multi-million-dollar wedding was supposed to be the final, crushing blow. Julian and Clara had spent weeks orchestrating the perfect sequence of degradation. They had assigned Elena to table 52, a cramped, drafty spot right next to the kitchen doors and the service bathrooms, where the waiters would constantly bump her chair. They had briefed the society photographers to take close-up, unflattering photos of her inevitable tears when Julian placed the ring on Clara's finger. They wanted to watch her drown in the agonizing contrast between the billionaire lifestyle she had lost and the pathetic, struggling existence he assumed she was still living. The elite crowd had been subtly tipped off, waiting with sharp, predatory smiles to whisper, mock, and sneer at the failed wife, who had dared to show her face. But the woman standing in the doorway didn't look like a victim. She looked like an empress. Elena did not slip into the room unnoticed. She commanded it. She wore a midnight blue silk gown that seemed to capture and absorb the light of the crystal chandeliers, flowing around her like liquid evening sky. The diamonds around her throat were not the delicate, modest pieces Julian had once bought her. They were raw, flawless cuts of architectural perfection that worth more than the entire wedding venue itself. Her posture was flawless, her chin held high, her eyes burning with a calm, terrifying serenity that instantly made every woman in the room feel underdressed and every man feel profoundly insignificant. Yet it wasn't just Elena's breathtaking transformation that struck a mortal blow to Julian's pride. It was the security detail that flanked her. 4 massive, stone-faced men in matching, immaculate charcoal suits stepped in perfect unison, their broad shoulders and earpieces signaling absolute, lethal authority. They moved with the quiet discipline of elite operatives, instantly forming a protective perimeter around her, pushing back the aggressive wedding photographers with a single warning glance. And then the final piece of the nightmare fell into place. Stepping up beside Elena, offering her his arm with an effortless, possessive grace, was a man whose face was stamped onto the cover of every major global financial magazine. It was Arthur Pendleton. A collective, terrified gasp rippled through the ballroom. Arthur Pendleton was not just wealthy. He was an economic titan, a notoriously reclusive billionaire CEO whose venture capital firm practically owned the infrastructure of the city. He was a man so powerful that politicians waited on his phone calls and international conglomerates crumbled at his whim. He never attended social events like this. He despised the shallow posturing of men like Julian Vance. In fact, Julian had spent the last 2 years desperately begging Arthur's secretaries for just a 5-minute meeting to save his own struggling shipping empire, requests that had been repeatedly discarded like trash. Now, Arthur Pendleton was standing in the center of Julian's own wedding, his eyes fixed on Elena with a look of fierce, unyielding devotion. He leaned down, whispering something softly in her ear, causing a stunning, radiant smile to break across her face. A smile Julian hadn't seen in a decade. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ghostly white. Clara's grip on his hand tightened so hard her manicured nails dug into his flesh, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden, bubbling jealousy. The entire narrative they had constructed, the story of the pathetic, discarded ex-wife crawling back to witness her replacement, had been violently obliterated in less than 3 seconds. Elena didn't look at table 52. She didn't look at the kitchen doors. Her head turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the guests who had been prepared to laugh at her, watching them collectively lower their heads in shame and awe. Finally, her eyes locked onto Julian. There was no anger in her expression. There was no pain, no longing, no regret. There was only a cold, devastating amusement. As Arthur escorted her down the central aisle, the guests involuntarily parted like the Red Sea, bowing slightly, entirely forgetting that Julian and Clara were supposed to be the center of attention. Julian felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. A terrifying question began to echo in the hollow chambers of his mind, drowning out the wedding march. How had a woman he ruined managed to rise so high? What dark, buried secrets about their past had she brought with her to this room? And as he looked at the sheer power radiating from the billionaire at her side, Julian realized with a sudden sickening certainty. He hadn't lured Elena into a trap. He had invited his own destruction. The silence in the grand ballroom remained absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to warp the very dimensions of the space. To the 500 onlookers, the scene was a spectacular, unscripted drama playing out in real time. But for Julian Vance, it was a sudden, violent confrontation with a past he thought he had successfully buried beneath mountains of legal paperwork and paid media smear campaigns. To understand the sheer terror currently clawing its way up Julian's throat, one had to understand the foundation upon which his entire empire, and his fragile ego, was built. Julian was a man driven not by a passion for commerce, but by a profound pathological need for control and validation. Raised in the shadow of a demanding patriarch, he had spent his youth overcompensating, adopting a ruthless, win-at-all-costs mentality that viewed human beings as assets to be acquired or liabilities to be liquidated. When he had married Elena 10 years prior, it hadn't been an act of love. It had been a calculated acquisition. Elena, the sole heiress to the prestigious but cash-strapped Sterling Logistics Group, possessed the one thing Julian's rapidly expanding shipping company lacked: a multi-generational legacy of trust, impeccable high society standing and proprietary global supply chain routes that her father had spent 40 years securing. Elena was brilliant, holding a master's degree in international trade, but her defining characteristic was her profound, almost naive capacity for empathy. She believed in honor, in legacy, and most fatally she had believed in Julian. For 7 years of marriage, Elena had been the silent architect of Julian's greatest successes. While he preened for financial journalists and took credit for every major expansion, it was Elena who worked past midnight in the Home Office, redrafting complex maritime contracts, pacifying volatile foreign trade unions, and using her family's deep social capital to open doors that would have remained permanently slammed in Julian's face. She did it all out of a deep desire to build a shared future, willingly stepping back into the shadows so her husband could shine. But Julian's deepest, darkest fear was weakness. He could not stand the private knowledge that his success was tethered to his wife's intellect and her family's heritage. The more indispensable Elena became, the more a toxic, resentful venom brewed within him. He began to view her competence as an insult, her quiet grace as a challenge to his masculinity. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a subordinate. He needed to look down on the person he shared a bed with to feel like a man. That was when Clara Sterling, ironically a distant, estranged cousin of Elena's who had been cut off from the family fortune years prior due to her volatile, parasitic nature, entered the picture. Clara recognized Julian's deep-seated insecurities instantly. Where Elena offered constructive criticism and intellectual partnership, Clara offered blind, sycophantic adoration and a shared appetite for malice. Clara became the mirror that reflected the grand, omnipotent image Julian desperately wanted to see of himself. Together, Julian and Clara had spent 18 months orchestrating a cold-blooded campaign to dismantle Elena's life. They didn't just want a divorce. They wanted a total liquidation of her existence. Utilizing forged financial documents, manipulated digital communications, and heavily bribed private investigators, Julian fabricated a narrative that Elena was embezzling funds from Sterling Logistics to fund an imaginary, highly scandalous extramarital affair. The betrayal had hit Elena like a physical blow, fracturing her world in a single afternoon. When she confronted Julian in their penthouse, holding the falsified dossiers, she hadn't cried out in anger. She had looked at him with a profound, crushing sorrow that made him hate her even more. "Why, Julian?" she had whispered, her voice trembling but her eyes piercing through his facade. "I gave you my father's life's work. I gave you my youth. I gave you my mind. Why do you need to destroy me to feel big?" His response had been a cold, mocking laugh. "Because, Elena, in this world there are predators and there are prey. You were weak enough to trust me. That makes you prey." Through a heavily rigged closed-door legal proceeding presided over by a judge whose re-election campaign Julian had covertly financed, Elena was stripped of everything. The ironclad prenuptial agreement was thrown out based on the fabricated fraud charges. She was forced to sign over the remaining shares of her father's logistics company to Julian's conglomerate for pennies on the dollar. Her reputation in high society was utterly incinerated. The very people who had attended her charity galas turned their backs on her, eager to distance themselves from a branded fraud and adulteress. Julian had left her with literally nothing but the clothes on her back, ensuring she was blacklisted from every major corporate firm in the city. For the past 3 years, Julian had insulated himself with luxury, believing he had won the ultimate victory. Yet a gnawing paranoia had persisted. Deep down he knew the truth. He knew he was a thief living in a house built on Elena's brilliance. That was why this wedding to Clara had been designed as the ultimate exclamation point on his triumph. He needed to see Elena broken, poorly dressed, and weeping at the back of the room to finally convince himself that he was superior to her. And now, as Julian stared down from the altar, the reality of the situation shattered his delusions. Elena stood less than 20 feet away, her presence radiating an undeniable, majestic authority that made the entire concept of her being prey laughably absurd. The midnight blue silk of her gown caught the ambient light, shimmering like deep ocean water. It was her face that truly paralyzed him. The hollow, exhausted look of a betrayed woman was entirely gone. Her skin was flawless, her eyes bright with an terrifyingly calm intelligence, and her jawline set with the iron resolve of someone who had walked through hell, conquered it, and bought the real estate. Beside her, Arthur Pendleton stood like an unyielding fortress. Arthur's history was legendary and terrifying. A man who had built a multi-billion-dollar global empire by systematically identifying undervalued assets, restructuring them with brutal efficiency, and crushing any competitor who used underhanded tactics. Arthur was known in the financial world as the Iron Architect, a man of absolute integrity who utterly despised corporate corruption and social climbing. He was a predator who hunted other predators. As the wedding guests watched in breathless awe, Arthur didn't look at the crowd. His focus remained entirely on Elena. The tenderness in his movements was unmistakable, yet it was laced with a fierce, protective edge that sent a clear message to everyone in the room. Touch her, whisper about her, look at her wrong, and I will erase you from the market. Julian's eyes darted frantically across the room, seeking reassurance but found none. The very guests he had primed to mock Elena were now adjusting their ties and smoothing their dresses, their expressions shifting from malicious anticipation to desperate, sycophantic desire to be noticed by Arthur Pendleton. Before we find out exactly how Elena managed to align herself with the most powerful man in the country, and what devastating secrets they are about to unleash on this wedding, I want to take a brief moment to speak to all of you watching. Stories of resilience, justice, and stepping into your absolute power are what we love to bring to life on this channel. If you believe that truth always finds a way to the light, please hit that like button right now. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Julian's arrogance. Do you think he deserves what's coming to him? And if you haven't subscribed yet, please join our incredible community today. Your subscription helps us produce these long, deeply detailed, high-quality stories just for you. Now let us return to the altar, where Clara's face was rapidly transforming from a triumphant smile into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. Clara leaned into Julian, her voice a harsh, frantic whisper that barely carried past the officiant. Julian, what is this? Why is she here like this? Who authorized those bodyguards? Do something. This is our day. She's supposed to be hiding in the back, dying of shame. Look at what she's wearing. That gown costs more than my entire bridal wardrobe. Fix this right now. Julian couldn't move. His legs felt like poured concrete. His mind was racing, trying to calculate the financial implications of what he was seeing. If Elena was with Arthur Pendleton, it meant Julian's desperate multi-million-dollar bids to secure a partnership with P. Button Delton Capital were not just dead, they had likely been a trap. Elena took a slow, deliberate step forward, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor with a rhythm that sounded to Julian like a countdown clock. Arthur kept pace with her perfectly, his hand resting reassuringly over hers on his arm. The 4 massive bodyguards moved with them, shifting into a defensive formation that effectively cut off the wedding coordinators who were frantically trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented breach of protocol. Elena stopped right at the edge of the front row of pews, directly facing the altar. She looked up at Julian, then her gaze drifted to Clara, taking in the extravagant, over-designed lace gown and the heavy, ostentatious diamonds Clara had insisted on buying. A small, elegant smile touched the corners of Elena's lips, a smile of pure, patronizing pity. She didn't speak a word, but her silence spoke volumes. It said, I know what you did. I know what you are. And I am finally ready to collect the debt. Julian felt a bead of sweat slowly trace its way down his spine. The foundation of his carefully constructed reality had just suffered a catastrophic structural failure, and the main event hadn't even begun. The atmospheric pressure inside the Grand Horizon ballroom dropped to a freezing register. The officiant, an older gentleman who had presided over the weddings of the city's elite for decades, stood frozen at the altar, his leather-bound book trembling slightly in his hands. He looked frantically from Julian's pale, sweat-slicked face to the imposing regal figure of Arthur Pendleton standing in the center aisle. The traditional script of the ceremony had been completely obliterated, replaced by a silent, high-stakes standoff that no one knew how to break. Julian swallowed hard, the sound loud in his own ears. Every survival instinct he possessed was screaming at him to de-escalate the situation, but his boundless arrogance, coupled with Clara's sharp, digging fingernails against his arm, pushed him over the edge. He couldn't let his guests, the very people he had invited to witness his ultimate triumph, see him cower in front of his ruined ex-wife. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Julian stepped forward, detaching himself from Clara's grip. He attempted to smooth the front of his tuxedo jacket, trying to summon the commanding corporate persona he used in boardrooms. He forced a stiff, unnatural smile onto his face, though his eyes remained wide and hyper-focused. Elena, Julian said, his voice cracking slightly before he corrected his pitch, projecting it so it echoed across the silent room. I must say we are all surprised to see you. When I sent the invitation, it was a gesture of goodwill, a way to show that despite our past difficulties, I wished for you to witness the start of my new life. But I didn't expect you to bring a circus with you. Disrupting a sacred ceremony with private security and uninvited guests is low even for you. A collective murmur rippled through the pews. Julian was trying to flip the script, to paint Elena as the unhinged, bitter ex-wife trying to ruin a beautiful wedding out of jealousy. Clara, sensing an opportunity to reclaim her spotlight, stepped up beside him, her face twisted into an expression of theatrical pity. Yes, Elena, she chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. If you needed money for a proper dress or a decent seat, you could have just asked us privately. There was no need to hire actors to play bodyguards or to drag Mr. Pendleton into your sad little desperate attempt to make Julian jealous. Please, leave quietly before you embarrass yourself any further. This is our day. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the chandeliers, listening to their insults as if they were nothing more than the buzzing of annoying insects. The utter lack of fear in her eyes was more terrifying to Julian than any screamed insult could have ever been. Before Elena could even part her lips to reply, Arthur Pendleton shifted his weight. The simple movement was enough to make Julian's heart skip a beat. Arthur looked at Julian, his gaze cold, analytical, and profoundly dismissive. The exact look a man gives a cockroach before stepping on it. Mr. Vance, Arthur's voice boomed through the ballroom, a rich, deep baritone that carried the absolute, unshakable authority of a man who commanded billions of dollars in global capital. Let us clarify something right now. I am not an uninvited guest. I am here as the primary stakeholder of the Sterling Logistics Group. And as for my presence beside Elena, she does not need to drag me anywhere. I go where she commands because she is the most brilliant corporate strategist I have ever had the privilege of partnering with. A sharp, audible gasp echoed from the front rows, where Julian's chief financial officer and board members were seated. The primary stakeholder of Sterling Logistics? Partnering with Elena? Julian's mind went into overdrive, frantically trying to piece together the financial puzzle. What are you talking about, Arthur? Julian stammered, completely forgetting his corporate dignity. Sterling Logistics was fully absorbed into Vance Maritime 3 years ago during the divorce liquidation. It doesn't exist as an independent entity anymore. I own those assets. You thought you owned them, Julian, Elena finally spoke. Her voice was like silk wrapped around steel, soft, elegant, yet utterly lethal. It contained no trace of the broken woman who had wept on a cold apartment floor 3 years ago. It was the voice of a woman who had reclaimed her soul. You see, Julian, Elena continued, taking a slow, graceful step closer to the altar, her bodyguards adjusting their positions seamlessly around her. When you used forged documents and bribed Judge Harrison to strip me of my father's company, you made a fatal error. You forgot to look at the underlying maritime holding structures. You were so eager to seize the physical ships and the local ports that you entirely overlooked the international intellectual property patents and the proprietary routing software, the very neural network that keeps those ships moving across the globe. Julian's face went from pale to a ghastly mottled green. What did you do? I didn't do anything but survive, Elena said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, brilliant intensity. But while you were busy spending millions of dollars on luxury penthouses, sports cars, and media campaigns to slander my name, I was working. I presented those proprietary international routing patents to Pendleton Capital. Over the last 24 months, Arthur and I have quietly acquired 49% of your company's outstanding debt through various offshore subsidiary holdings. And today, less than 2 hours ago, the International Maritime Courts in Geneva handed down a final, unappealable ruling regarding the fraudulent seizure of Sterling Logistics. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the absolute terror sink into Julian's bones. The court has ordered a total freeze on all Vance Maritime assets globally, effective immediately, pending a full criminal asset recovery investigation, Elena announced calmly. You don't own those ships anymore, Julian. They are currently being impounded at ports from Rotterdam to Singapore. You are completely insolvent. The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Members of Julian's board of directors stood up, their faces filled with panic, pulling out their phones to check the financial markets. Clara looked at Julian, her chest heaving, her hands shaking violently. Julian, tell me she's lying. Clara screamed, her voice losing all its aristocratic pretense, revealing the raw, ugly desperation underneath. Tell me this bitch is lying. We are supposed to fly to the French Riviera tonight. The penthouse, the yacht, tell me it's not gone. Julian couldn't speak. He felt as if the floor beneath his feet had suddenly liquefied, dropping him into a dark, bottomless abyss. The trap had snapped. He had invited his ex-wife here to watch her drown, only to realize that he was the one locked in a cage, while the tide was rapidly rising. Before we see how Julian attempts to fight back against this catastrophic revelation, and how far Elena and Arthur are willing to go to exact total justice, let's take a quick moment. If your heart is pounding right now and you are absolutely hooked on this incredible twist, please leave a comment down below with the word, justice, so I know you're riding this emotional wave with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel right now if you haven't already. We have so many more twists, turns, and emotional payoffs coming your way, and your subscription ensures you never miss a single episode. Hit that button and join us. Now let us return to the altar, where the illusion of Julian Vance's empire was crumbling into dust before the eyes of the entire world. Arthur Pendleton looked at his watch, a cold, brutal smile playing on his lips. The markets have just opened their afternoon trading session, Mr. Vance. If I were you, I would check your phone. Your board of directors is currently dump selling their shares to the only buyer left in the market, Pendleton Capital. By the time you say, I do, you won't even own the tuxedo you're standing in. Julian stood paralyzed, a prisoner of his own arrogance, as the woman he had tried to destroy stared back at him with the calm, unyielding gaze of a conqueror. The grand ballroom, once a temple of carefully curated aristocratic perfection, had degenerated into a high-stakes corporate battlefield. The romantic melody of the harpist had ceased entirely, the musician sitting frozen with her hands suspended over the strings, terrified to make a sound. Across the room, the frantic clacking of fingers on smartphone screens replaced the clinking of champagne flutes. Julian's chief financial officer, a man who had complicitly signed off on the fraudulent documents 3 years ago, was currently leaning against a marble pillar, his face pale as ash as he frantically whispered into his phone, his eyes darting toward Elena like a hunted animal. Julian felt a cold, oily sweat slicking his palms. The sheer speed of the strike had paralyzed his cognitive faculties. He was a man accustomed to the slow, bureaucratic dance of corporate litigation, where high-priced lawyers could delay a crisis for years. But Arthur Pendleton and Elena had not filed a standard lawsuit. They had executed a lightning-fast, multinational decapitation strike against his entire financial existence. Clara's voice shattered his paralysis, her tone rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch that caused several front-row guests to wince. Julian, do something. Call the police. Call security. They are trespassing at our wedding. They are making up lies to ruin my reputation. Look at everyone staring at us. I don't care about maritime courts in Geneva. I care about this ballroom. Have them thrown out. She turned her venomous gaze toward Elena, her manicured fingers clawing at the air between them. You miserable, bitter parasite. You couldn't stand that Julian loved me more. You couldn't stand that I got the life, the diamond, the legacy. You engineered this fake little stunt to try and steal back my spotlight. You're nothing but a washed-up fraud, Elena. Everyone in this city knows you slept with your father's clients to try and save that dying logistics company. The ugly, fabricated slander hung heavily in the air. 3 years ago, that exact rumor, planted in local tabloids by Clara and financed by Julian, had shattered Elena's social standing. But this time the reaction was entirely different. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't offer an emotional defense. Instead, Arthur Pendleton stepped half a pace forward, his massive frame radiating an aura of such lethal, concentrated power that Clara involuntarily took a step back, her heel catching on the train of her wedding gown. Miss Sterling, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, rumbling whisper that somehow carried further than Clara's screeching. Every single word that just exited your mouth constitutes actionable defamation. Furthermore, the digital forensic team at Pendleton Capital has spent the last 14 months recovering the encrypted server logs from the PR firm you employed to disseminate those specific falsehoods. We possess the bank wire transfers, signed by your own hand using Julian's corporate accounts, paying journalists to destroy Elena's name. Arthur paused, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Clara's terrified face. The criminal indictments for corporate espionage, wire fraud and character assassination have already been signed by a federal prosecutor. They are being filed at the courthouse as we speak. So I suggest you choose your next words very, very carefully, because they will be read back to you under oath in a court of law. Clara's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, all the color draining from her lips. She turned to Julian, her hands shaking violently as she grabbed his arm. Julian, tell me he's bluffing. Tell me he can't do that. You promised me we were untouchable. You promised me she was dead and buried. Julian barely heard her. His focus was entirely on Elena, who was watching him with a serene, unbothered detachment that cut deeper than any knife. He needed to find a loophole. He needed to find a way to break her composure, to find the weak, emotional woman he used to dominate. Elena, Julian said, his voice dropping its aggressive edge, adopting a low, manipulative tone that he had used hundreds of times during their marriage to make her doubt her own sanity. He took a slow step down from the altar, ignoring Clara entirely. Let's be rational here. You're angry. I understand that. The divorce was harsh. But you're letting your emotions blind you. You're letting Arthur Pendleton use you as a pawn to execute a hostile takeover of Vance Maritime. Do you honestly think a man of his stature cares about you? He's using your past grievances to steal my empire for pennies on the dollar. The moment he owns my ships, he will discard you just like everyone else. He took another step closer, his eyes pleading, attempting to project a false sense of shared history. We built that company together, Elena. Don't let an outsider destroy it out of spite. We can settle this privately. I can give you a seat on the board. I can restore your family's name. Just tell his security to step down. Let us finish this ceremony and we will talk in my office tomorrow morning. For old time's sake. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. A desperate attempt to appeal to the deeply empathetic, self-sacrificing woman Elena had once been. For a fraction of a second, a heavy, tense silence gripped the ballroom as the guests waited to see if the emotional gambit would work. Elena looked down at the space between them, then looked up into Julian's eyes. For the first time, a look of genuine emotion crossed her face. But it wasn't sadness and it certainly wasn't doubt. It was a profound, unadulterated disgust. For old time's sake, Julian? Elena asked, her voice carrying a terrifyingly calm clarity. Are you referring to the old times when you had my father's medical records leaked to the press to make him look incompetent while he was dying of cancer, just so you could force him off the board? Or perhaps the old times when you locked me out of our home in the middle of a winter storm, telling the building security that I was a trespasser, while you and Clara were inside celebrating the theft of my legacy? She shook her head slowly, a cold smile appearing on her lips. You always believed my empathy was a weakness, Julian. You thought because I chose to love deeply and trust completely, it meant I lacked the capacity to fight. But you misunderstood me entirely. I didn't lose my strength during those 3 years in the dark. I simply learned how to direct it with absolute precision. She turned slightly, looking toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. And as for Arthur using me, you really have no idea what's happening here, do you? Before Julian could process her words, the ballroom doors swung open yet again. This time it wasn't security guards or corporate tycoons who entered. It was a group of 4 uniform-clad federal marshals, accompanied by 2 agents from the State Regulatory Commission, their badges gleaming under the bright lights. They moved with purposeful, intimidating strides directly down the center aisle toward the altar. The entire crowd gasped, several high society women covering their mouths in terror. The reality of actual criminal consequences had just crashed into their pristine, insulated world. Before we witness the absolute chaos that erupts as the authorities step onto the altar, and find out the earth-shattering secret Elena is about to drop regarding how deep Julian's betrayal truly went, let's take a quick moment together. This story is reaching a boiling point and the tension is absolutely unreal. If you are rooting for Elena to take back everything that belongs to her, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below letting me know what you think of Julian's desperate attempt to gaslight her. Did you see right through his fake apology? We read every single comment and your engagement is what drives this channel to keep producing these incredibly deep, gripping narratives. Subscribe now so you never miss the resolution of these epic tales of justice. Now let us return to the altar, where the law has just arrived to interrupt Julian Vance's wedding in the most public way imaginable. The lead marshal stopped right in front of Julian, pulling a folded, stamped legal document from his breast pocket. Julian Vance? Clara Sterling. Julian's voice was trapped in his throat, his face completely devoid of color. He could only nod weakly. We have a federal warrant for the immediate seizure of all physical and digital assets under the jurisdiction of Vance Maritime and its executives, the marshal announced clearly, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Furthermore, you are both ordered to remain within the jurisdiction of the state court pending an immediate asset verification audit. No one leaves this building until our digital forensics team has secured the server networks upstairs. Clara let out a strangled scream, grabbing the marshal's sleeve. You can't do this. Look at me. I am a bride. This is a multi-million-dollar wedding. Who authorized this? The marshal calmly detached her hand from his arm, his expression utterly unyielding. The authorization came from the chairperson of the State Maritime Regulatory Commission, ma'am. Julian turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with a horrific, sudden realization as he looked at Elena. Elena stepped beside Arthur, her hand resting gracefully on his arm. Arthur looked down at her with a profound, unshakable respect that made Julian's chest tighten with an agonizing, possessive jealousy. You see, Julian, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a scalpel. Elena isn't my pawn. She's my partner. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, she is the newly appointed chairperson of the State Maritime Commission, the very agency that regulates your entire industry. You wanted her to watch you build your future, Julian. But the truth is she already owns your past. The revelation fell like a physical blow, sending a violent shockwave through the 500 guests packed into the Grand Horizon ballroom. Chairperson of the State Maritime Commission. The words echoed in Julian's ears, sounding like a death knell. The very regulatory body that held the absolute power to grant shipping licenses, approve deepwater port access, and penalize maritime infractions was now headed by the woman he had discarded, slandered, and stripped of her dignity. Julian felt the room tilt. His chest heaved as he stared at Elena, his mind frantically rewinding through the last 3 years. Every bureaucratic delay his company had faced, every sudden unannounced safety audit at his international docks, every delayed port clearance that had cost his firm millions in late fees. It hadn't been bad luck. It hadn't been the changing economic climate. It had been her. Quietly, meticulously, and with absolute legal precision, Elena had been tightening a noose around Vance Maritime from the shadow of the state capitol, waiting for the exact moment to pull it taut. No, this is impossible, Clara whimpered, her voice cracking as she clutched her expensive lace veil, which was now torn and trailing on the marble floor. Julian, you told me she was living in a slum. You told me she was working as a low-level clerk under an assumed name. You said she was broken. How could she be a commissioner? How could she be standing next to him? She turned her wild, bloodshot eyes toward the guests in the front row, looking for her high society friends, her bridesmaids, her influencers, anyone to validate her status. But the elite crowd had already begun to shift. The predatory smiles they had prepared for Elena were now entirely gone, replaced by looks of sycophantic awe. Several prominent investors who had been standing on Julian's side of the aisle quietly slipped across the carpet, subtly adjusting their positions to stand closer to Elena and Arthur's security perimeter. The betrayal was instantaneous and absolute. In their world, power was the only currency that mattered, and Julian Vance's account had just been frozen. Arthur Pendleton took a deliberate step closer to Elena, his broad shoulders casting a protective, imposing shadow over her. He looked down at her not with the cold, calculating eye of a business tycoon, but with a profound, searing warmth that made Julian's blood boil with an agonizing sense of loss. She wasn't hiding, Clara, Arthur said, his deep voice slicing through the frantic whispers of the ballroom. She was recovering. When I found Elena 3 years ago, she was sitting in a hospital waiting room, completely exhausted, holding her father's hand during his final hours. She had nothing left but her intellect and an unyielding sense of justice. While Julian was busy transferring stolen funds into your offshore accounts to buy you that ridiculous 5-carat diamond ring, Elena was presenting a masterfully structured restructuring plan to the Pendleton Capital Board. She didn't ask me for a handout. She asked me for a lever. And together we turned that lever into an unstoppable force. Julian's gaze locked onto the way Arthur's hand rested on the small of Elena's back. A gesture of absolute respect, trust, and a deeply rooted organic affection that Julian had never been capable of giving her. In that moment, a dark, hidden truth began to unravel in Julian's mind. He realized that his hatred for Elena had never truly been about her family's logistics company or her intellect. It had been about his own profound inadequacy. He had known, even during their happiest moments, that Elena possessed an internal light, an unbreakable moral core that he could neither replicate nor control. And by trying to destroy her, he had only succeeded in driving her into the arms of a man who actually deserved her brilliance. Elena stepped forward, detaching herself from Arthur's side just enough to stand directly beneath the massive crystal chandelier, looking up at the altar where her marriage had once been celebrated, and where her replacement now stood unraveling. But we aren't here today just to talk about shipping lanes or regulatory licenses, Julian, Elena said, her voice dropping to a register of devastating, quiet intensity that made the entire room hold its breath. We are here because of a debt that must be paid in full. 3 years ago you didn't just steal my father's company. You stole his life. Julian's breath hitched in his throat, a sudden, primal terror seizing his heart. Elena, stop. Your father was sick. He had terminal cancer. His death had nothing to do with me. Didn't it? Elena asked, her eyes burning with a fierce diamond-sharp anger that finally broke through her calm facade, revealing the raw, deep-seated pain she had carried for 36 months. 2 weeks before you filed those fraudulent embezzlement charges against me, you discovered that my father's life-saving experimental treatment in Switzerland required a continuous, heavy influx of capital from the Sterling Logistics Private Trust, a trust that required my co-signature to release. You deliberately froze that specific trust account under the guise of an internal corporate audit. You blocked his medical funding, Julian. You knew that every week the funds were delayed, his condition became more irreversible. You didn't just want to win a divorce. You wanted to ensure he wasn't alive to help me fight back. A collective, horrified gasp erupted from the wedding guests. Accusations of corporate fraud were one thing. The cold-blooded, indirect termination of an old man's medical care was a level of malice that sickened even the cynical high society elite. Clara stumbled backward, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. Julian, you told me the trust was frozen because of a banking error. You said it was just a coincidence. Julian couldn't answer. He stood completely exposed, the monster behind the tailored tuxedo stripped bare in front of the entire world. The very trap he had meticulously designed to publicly disgrace his ex-wife had become an international stage for his own unmasking. Before we find out how Julian attempts to escape the crushing weight of this horrific revelation, and what desperate, dangerous move he makes next to try and salvage his dying empire, let's take an urgent moment together. The mask has officially fallen and the truth is finally out in the open. If your heart is absolutely racing for Elena right now, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on Julian's horrific actions. Did you expect him to go that far? Your support is what keeps this channel alive, allowing us to bring you these massive, highly detailed 40-minute emotional journeys every single week. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you don't miss a single beat of the ultimate climax. Now let us return to the altar, where the shadows of the past have finally caught up to Julian Vance, and the true darkness of his hour is about to begin. Arthur Pendleton stepped beside Elena, his hand locking firmly with hers in a display of unyielding unity. The Swiss bank records have been subpoenaed, Julian. The digital trail of your deliberate obstruction of those medical funds is fully documented. The marshals aren't just here for your ships. They are here for you. The federal marshals moved with a heavy rhythmic cadence that sounded like the steady approach of an executioner. The lead officer drew a pair of high-grade steel handcuffs from his tactical belt, the sharp metallic click echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the ballroom like a gunshot. Julian felt his knees buckle. The room spun in a chaotic blur of white silk flashing cameras, and the horrified faces of his peers. He looked down at his hands, hands that had signed away Elena's life, hands that had shaken on multi-million-dollar deals, and realized they were trembling so violently he could barely keep them steady. The illusion of his omnipotence was gone. The grand empire he had stolen, the high society respect he had manufactured, the ironclad control he had wielded over everyone around him, it had all vanished in the span of less than 30 minutes. No, stay away from me. Clara suddenly shrieked, her voice breaking into a jagged, panicked wail. She violently pushed herself away from Julian, her heavy bridal veil ripping completely free from her hair and falling to the floor, where it was instantly trampled under the muddy boots of the advancing officers. I have nothing to do with this. He did it. Julian did it all. He told me the old man was going to die anyway. He told me he was just securing our future. I didn't sign those papers. Don't touch me. She fell to her knees, weeping hysterically, her expensive custom-designed makeup smearing across her face in ugly, dark streaks. She was a parasitic creature to the core, and the moment the host body began to die, her only instinct was to flee. Julian looked down at her, a bitter, icy realization freezing his chest. This was the woman he had traded Elena for. This was the sycophant he had chosen to reflect his greatness. In his pursuit of a partner he could dominate, he had aligned himself with a coward who would throw him to the wolves at the very first sign of trouble. But Julian wasn't ready to go down quietly. The toxic, desperate arrogance that had driven him his entire life flared up one last time, morphing into a dangerous, erratic rage. His eyes darted around the altar, looking for any way out, any weapon, any leverage. Before anyone could react, Julian lunged forward. He didn't go for the marshals. He didn't go for Arthur. In a split second of pure, unadulterated cowardice, he grabbed the older wedding officiant by the collar of his robes, yanking the elderly man in front of him like a human shield, backing up toward the heavy velvet curtains that masked the service exit behind the altar. "Stay back!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking, his face distorted into a mask of pure madness. His hand went into his tuxedo pocket, gripping a heavy, silver-plated pen he always carried for signing contracts, pressing the sharp metal tip against the old man's neck. In his unhinged state, he wanted everyone to think it was a blade. "Stay back, or I swear I'll take him down with me. Elena, you think you've won? You think you can just walk in here and erase me? I built this city. I own those docks. You're nothing without me. You're just a broken little girl whose father died because she wasn't smart enough to save him." The ballroom erupted into sheer, unmitigated chaos. Guests screamed, knocking over tables and chairs as they stampeded toward the main exits. The four massive bodyguards flanking Elena instantly stepped into a defensive wall, their hands moving inside their jackets, their eyes locked on Julian with lethal intent. Arthur's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The calm, calculating corporate titan disappeared, replaced by a man of raw, primitive fury. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin and his fists balled into hammers. He took a step forward, ready to tear Julian apart with his bare hands, completely disregarding the danger. But Elena placed a single firm hand on Arthur's chest. The touch was electric. Arthur stopped instantly, his eyes snapping to hers. Despite the madman screaming on the altar, despite the chaos tearing the room apart, Elena's eyes remained two pools of absolute frozen stillness. She looked at Arthur, a subtle, unspoken communication passing between them, a bond of deep, unshakable trust that had been forged through 3 years of surviving the worst storms life could throw at them. She was telling him to trust her. She was telling him that the monster had already lost. Elena turned her gaze back to Julian. She didn't look at the makeshift weapon. She didn't look at his manic expression. She looked past his facade, straight into the hollow, terrified core of his soul. "Look at yourself, Julian," Elena said, her voice completely calm, devoid of any fear, carrying over the sounds of the screaming crowd. "Take a good look at what you've become. You started this day intending to disgrace me in front of the world. And now you are standing on your own altar, holding an innocent old man hostage with a pen, abandoned by the woman you chose, surrounded by the law, and exposed as a murderer to everyone who ever respected you." She took a slow, deliberate step toward the altar, completely ignoring the warning shouts from the marshals. "You think you're holding a shield, Julian?" Elena asked, a faint smile of pure, devastating pity touching her lips. "The only thing you are holding is the mirror to your own absolute failure. My father didn't die because I wasn't smart enough to save him. He died knowing that I was strong enough to outlast you. And today his legacy lives on. Yours ends in handcuffs." Julian stared at her, the absolute certainty in her voice striking him like a physical blow. He looked down at the old man he was holding, then looked at the sea of cameras still recording his every move from the media corner. He looked at Arthur Pendleton, who was watching him like a predator waiting for the absolute final second to strike. He looked at Elena, who stood entirely untouchable, surrounded by a light he could never put out. The energy completely drained from Julian's body. The terrifying realization of his own total, irreversible defeat crushed his spine. His hand shook and the silver pen slipped from his fingers, clinking harmlessly onto the marble floor. He let go of the officiant's collar, his arms dropping to his sides as he stumbled backward against the altar table, his head falling into his hands. The federal marshals didn't hesitate. They lunged up the steps, tackling Julian to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back, and slamming the steel cuffs around his wrists with a heavy final snap. Before we see the beautiful emotional turning point where Elena finally closes this dark chapter of her life, and how Arthur helps her step into a future filled with love and absolute victory, let's take an urgent moment together. The darkest hour has passed, the villain has been brought to his knees, and justice has officially been served. If you are incredibly proud of Elena's strength and resilience, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment down below with the words, "True Queen," to honor her journey from the ashes to the throne. Your engagement keeps our channel going, and we want to make sure you're right there with us as we head into the beautiful, triumphant final acts of this story. Subscribe now and join the family. Now, let us move past the chaos of Julian's arrest, where a new dawn is finally breaking for the woman who survived it all. As the marshals dragged a weeping, broken Julian Vance out through the side doors in absolute disgrace, the remaining guests stood in breathless, respectful silence. Elena stood in the center of the ruined ballroom, her shoulders dropping slightly as a massive, deep breath escaped her lips. The weight of 3 years of pain, hiding and fighting had finally lifted. And as she turned, Arthur was already there, his arms opening to pull her into a tight, fiercely protective embrace that promised her she would never have to fight alone again. The heavy, chaotic echo of Julian Vance's boots fading down the service corridor marked the exact moment the past officially lost its grip on Elena's life. The grand ballroom was still tangled in the aftermath of the storm. Shattered crystal glasses littered the edges of the pews, overturned velvet chairs lay scattered across the polished floor, and the expensive floral arrangements hung limp, their artificial perfection ruined by the sudden surge of reality. But in the very center of the room none of that mattered. The space around Elena and Arthur seemed to quiet down, the ambient noise of the lingering guests fading into a distant, insignificant hum. Elena stood perfectly still within Arthur's embrace, her forehead resting gently against the crisp fabric of his tuxedo jacket. For 3 long, grueling years, she had kept her spine perfectly straight, her emotions locked behind an impenetrable wall of strategic calculation and survival instinct. She had survived the freezing nights after the divorce, the agonizing hospital vigils beside her dying father, and the countless hours spent staring at cold corporate spreadsheets, looking for the single thread that would unravel Julian's stolen empire. She had been an island of pure, unyielding determination. But now, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of Arthur's heart beneath her palm, the iron wall finally crumbled. A single hot tear escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek, followed quickly by another. They weren't tears of sorrow, nor were they tears of regret. They were the tears of a warrior who had finally been told the war was over. Her shoulders trembled slightly as the immense, crushing weight of the debt she had carried for her father's memory was safely laid down. Arthur didn't say a word. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her to be strong. Instead, his arms tightened around her, his large hands resting firmly against her back, creating a human fortress that completely insulated her from the prying eyes of the remaining high society crowd. He leaned his head down, his lips gently brushing the crown of her hair, inhaling the faint, comforting scent of jasmine she always wore. "I've got you, Elena," Arthur whispered, his deep voice carrying a raw, emotional vulnerability that no financial journalist or corporate rival would ever be privileged to hear. "You did it. It's over. You brought him to justice and your father's name is completely clear. You can breathe now. I'm right here and I am never letting go." The organic depth of their connection had not been born in flashy ballrooms or through transactional corporate alliances. It had been forged in the quiet, unglamorous trenches of reconstruction. When Arthur had first met Elena 3 years ago, he had expected a broken woman looking for a financial handout. Instead, he had found a brilliant, fierce mind wrapped in a soul of absolute integrity. As they worked late into the night at Pendleton Capital, analyzing shipping data and drafting legal strategies, Arthur had watched her rise from the ashes not with a desire for petty revenge, but with a profound hunger for true justice. Slowly, respect had deepened into admiration, and admiration had ignited into a fierce, consuming love. A love built on mutual intellectual equality and a shared moral compass. Julian had wanted a woman he could diminish to make himself feel large. Arthur had found a woman whose brilliance made the entire universe feel infinitely bigger. Elena took a deep, steadying breath, pulling back just enough to look up into Arthur's striking gray eyes. A radiant, breathtaking smile broke across her face, completely illuminating her features and wiping away the last remaining shadows of the past 3 years. She reached up, her fingers gently tracing the hard line of his jaw, feeling the tension finally melting away from him as well. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice rich with an emotional clarity that vibrated through his chest. "For believing in me when I was just a ghost in a hospital waiting room. For standing beside me in the dark. I couldn't have opened these doors alone." "You opened them with your own mind, Elena," Arthur replied, his eyes burning with an intense, unyielding devotion. I just made sure no one could lock them from the outside again. Now let's finish what we came here to do. Elena turned slowly, her hand remaining firmly intertwined with Arthur's, their fingers locked together in a silent vow of permanent partnership. She looked out at the remaining crowd. The high society elite, the very people who had gossiped about her failure, the investors who had happily signed contracts with Julian after her downfall, stood in a loose, intimidated semicircle. They looked like children caught in a lie, desperately waiting to see if the new chairperson of the State Maritime Commission was going to exercise her wrath. But Elena didn't see enemies anymore. She saw a blank canvas. Before we witness the spectacular world-altering climax where Elena takes back the keys to her father's empire and delivers the ultimate heart-stopping twist to the financial world, let's take a quick moment together. We are hovering right on the edge of the ultimate victory, and the emotional payoff is absolutely beautiful. If you believe that true love is built on respect, equality, and standing by each other through the darkest storms, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment down below with the word forever to celebrate Elena and Arthur's incredible bond. Your subscription ensures that our channel can continue bringing you these incredibly deep, masterfully paced stories every single week. Hit that button and step into the light with us. Now, let us return to the center of the ballroom, where Elena is about to turn the ruins of her ex-husband's wedding into the foundation of a glorious new era. Elena looked toward the front row where Julian's chief financial officer was trembling, holding a tablet containing the live-updating stock market data. "Mr. Albright," Elena called out, her voice echoing with the absolute authority of a sovereign ruler. The CFO practically jumped out of his skin, stumbling forward as he clutched the tablet. "Why, yes, Commissioner." "Yes, Miss Sterling. I believe you have some financial data to read to the room," Elena said, her elegant smile widening. "Don't keep the stakeholders waiting." Mr. Albright's fingers trembled so violently against the glass screen of his tablet that he nearly dropped it onto the marble floor. He swallowed hard, his face a ghostly, translucent white under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. The 500 elite guests leaned forward in unison, their breath caught in their throats, waiting for the final execution of the Vance Empire to be read aloud. The numbers just finalized, Commissioner," Albright stammered, his voice cracking under the absolute weight of the data. As of 4 minutes ago, a massive, synchronized block order sell-off triggered a circuit breaker on our primary stock. 49% of Vance Maritime's public equity was liquidated by our institutional investors within a 12-minute window following the news of the federal asset freeze. He looked up from the screen, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute reverence as he looked at the woman standing before him. Every single one of those shares was instantly absorbed by a single purchasing entity operating through a blind trust. The trust just filed its disclosure with the Regulatory Commission. The purchasing entity is Pendleton Capital, operating on behalf of its chief managing partner. Albright paused, drawing a ragged, shallow breath before delivering the final blow. As of this exact moment, Julian Vance owns 0% of the company. The board of directors has been legally dissolved by emergency mandate. Elena Sterling, you now hold a 51% absolute controlling interest in the global conglomerate. You are the sole owner of Vance Maritime. A deafening, collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom, followed by a wave of stunned, frantic whispers. The guests looked at one another in sheer disbelief. In the span of less than 40 minutes, a multi-million-dollar wedding designed to publicly humiliate a discarded ex-wife had transformed into the most aggressive, flawless corporate hostile takeover in the city's history. The trap hadn't just snapped shut on Julian, it had utterly erased his entire lineage from the economic map. Clara, still huddled on the floor in her ruined, mud-stained bridal gown, let out a low, animalistic groan of pure despair. The realization that she had thrown away her integrity, her family relationships, and her soul for a man who was now completely bankrupt and facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary broke her remaining sanity. She wept into her hands, entirely ignored by the very high society peers who had preened around her just an hour prior. Elena stood beneath the shimmering light of the chandelier, her midnight blue gown catching the reflection of the glass, making her look like a celestial being commanding a fallen kingdom. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile with petty malice. She simply adjusted her posture, her spine straight, her presence radiating an undeniable majestic authority that demanded absolute obedience. "Thank you for the verification, Mr. Albright," Elena said, her voice clear, calm, and carrying the absolute weight of a sovereign ruler. "Now let us make our first executive decision. Effective immediately, Vance Maritime is dead. The company will be entirely restructured, rebranded, and integrated back into its original name, the Sterling Logistics Group. My father's name will be restored to the masthead of every ship, every port, and every corporate office from this day forward." She turned her gaze slowly toward the remaining board members and major investors standing in the front pews, her eyes flashing with a sharp, warning intensity. "For those of you who stood by and watched Julian falsify records 3 years ago, choosing to profit from his theft rather than stand for the truth, your exit packages are currently being drafted by our legal team. You have until 5 o'clock this evening to clear your desks. The era of corruption in this company is officially over." The targeted investors lowered their heads in deep, silent shame, unable to meet her gaze, before quietly turning and exiting the ballroom through the main doors, their careers effectively ended by a single sentence. Arthur Pendleton stepped up directly beside her, his massive frame a protective, unyielding wall of support. He looked down at Elena, his chest swelling with a profound, fierce pride that radiated through his entire being. He didn't see a business partner executing a strategy. He saw the love of his life reclaiming her rightful throne with the grace and power of a true queen. Arthur turned back to face the remaining crowd, his deep, booming baritone slicing through the last remnants of the chaotic whispers. "And let it be known across this city and across the global market that Pendleton Capital has signed an exclusive, permanent joint venture alliance with the Sterling Logistics Group. Anyone who attempts to challenge the validity of Elena's ownership, or anyone who attempts to revive the slanders of the past, will find themselves in a direct, catastrophic conflict with the entire financial weight of my firm." He reached down, his large hand warmly enveloping Elena's, their fingers locking together in a visual display of unbreakable solidarity. Elena Sterling is no longer a woman surviving in the shadows. She is the future of international trade in this territory. And she has the absolute backing of everything I own. The sheer scale of the victory was breathtaking. The woman who had been dragged through the mud, blacklisted from her industry, and left with $0 in her account had risen to become the most powerful economic force in the city, flanked by the most feared and respected billionaire titan in the country. The justice was poetic, absolute, and thoroughly earned. Before we move into the breathtaking, emotional final act where Elena and Arthur finally walk out of this ruined ballroom together to begin their beautiful new life of love, recovery, and limitless potential, let's take one last urgent moment together. This has been an absolutely epic journey of resilience, truth, and the ultimate victory of light over darkness. If you are cheering out loud for Elena right now, please hit that subscribe button immediately. Leave a comment down below with the word triumph, so we can celebrate this beautiful, massive payoff together. Your subscriptions are what allow us to dedicate the time and energy to craft these incredibly deep, emotional 40-minute scripts for you every single week. Join our amazing community right now so you never miss a single masterpiece. Now let us step into the final sunset of this journey, where a beautiful new beginning is waiting to unfold for the woman who conquered the storm. Elena looked up at Arthur, her eyes shining with a deep, emotional warmth that completely melted away the icy resolve she had maintained all afternoon. The battlefield had been cleared. The debt had been paid. Her father's soul was finally at peace, and her own heart was wide open, ready to receive the love she had denied herself for so long. "Let's go home, Arthur," Elena whispered softly, her voice filled with a profound sense of peace. Arthur smiled, a beautiful, genuine expression of pure devotion, and escorted her down the central aisle, the remaining guests voluntarily bowing their heads as the true rulers of the city walked out into the light. The heavy oak doors of the grand venue swung closed behind them, shutting out the ruined ballroom, the frantic murmurs of the elite, and the shattered remnants of Julian Vance's pride. As Elena and Arthur stepped out onto the wide, sun-drenched marble terrace, a gentle autumn breeze swept across the plaza, carrying with it the crisp, clean scent of the nearby harbor. The suffocating weight of the past 3 years vanished into the air, replaced by a profound, sweeping sense of absolute freedom. For the first time in 36 months, Elena closed her eyes and simply breathed. She tilted her head up toward the sky, letting the warm afternoon sunlight wash over her face. The internal armor she had worn for so long was gone, leaving behind only the radiant, unshakable peace of a woman who had fought through hell, reclaimed her soul, and won her complete redemption. Arthur stood beside her, his hand remaining firmly clasped in hers. He didn't rush her. He stood like an unyielding anchor, his gray eyes filled with a quiet, fierce adoration as he watched the tension leave her body. When she opened her eyes and looked up at him, the depth of emotion passing between them was profound. This wasn't a connection built on the superficial glitz of high society. It was a love forged in the quiet trenches of rebuilding a broken life, anchored by absolute respect and intellectual equality. "How do you feel?" Arthur asked softly, his deep baritone laced with a rare tenderness as he reached up, using the back of his hand to gently brush a stray lock of dark hair away from her face. "I feel light," Elena replied, a soft, beautiful laugh escaping her lips. "For so long I thought about this day. I thought about the justice, the court rulings, the reclaiming of my father's name. But I didn't realize that the greatest victory wouldn't be taking back the company. It would be taking back my life." She looked out toward the horizon, where the massive cranes of the city port were visible against the blue sky. "My father spent his entire life building that legacy with honor. Julian thought he could erase that honor with money and lies. But today the world knows the truth. The sterling name is clean and my father can finally rest in peace. And the empire is in the right hands now," Arthur said, a proud smile touching his lips. He turned her gently so she was facing him fully, his hands resting warmly on her waist. "You are the chairperson, Elena. You are the sole owner of the largest logistics network on the coast. You've conquered the market, you've rewritten the rules, and you've brought the corrupt to their knees. But more than any of that, you survived. You never let their darkness change the purity of your light." Elena placed her hands over his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring heartbeat that had given her strength when her own felt like it was failing. "I survived because you reminded me of who I was, Arthur. When the rest of the world turned their backs on me, when I was completely blacklisted and broke, you looked past the rumors. You saw me." "I saw greatness," Arthur corrected softly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intense, unyielding devotion. "The moment you walked into my office 3 years ago with nothing but a stack of data and a fire in your eyes, I knew my life would never be the same. Working with you, watching your brilliant mind reconstruct what was stolen, it's been the greatest privilege of my life. But loving you is my greatest victory." The vulnerability in his voice was absolute. Arthur Pendleton, the reclusive corporate titan feared by every executive in the country, was completely surrendered to the woman standing before him. He leaned down slowly, his lips meeting hers in a deep, lingering kiss that sealed their past victories and promised a limitless future. It was a kiss filled with the warmth of 1,000 sunsets, a sacred vow that she would never have to walk through a storm alone again. As they finally pulled apart, the sound of a sleek, black luxury sedan pulling up to the curb broke the quiet of the terrace. The driver stepped out, holding the door open for them with a respectful bow. Elena looked back one last time at the grand venue. Inside, the law was still cataloging the crimes of the man who had tried to destroy her. Outside, the world was wide open, waiting for her to step into her true power. She turned to Arthur, her hand slipping effortlessly back into his, her face illuminated by a brilliant, triumphant smile. "Where to, Madam Chairperson?" Arthur asked with a playful, adoring wink as he gestured toward the car. "Let's go to the docks," Elena said, her voice ringing with anticipation and joy. "I want to see my father's name put back on the first ship. It's a new day, Arthur. And we have an empire to run." Together they stepped into the vehicle, leaving the ruins of the past behind them as they drove off into the golden horizon, united in love, triumphant in justice, and stepping forward into a beautiful, limitless new beginning.